What's up, everybody? We have 10 minutes here, and we're going to talk about rings, and more specifically, torquing your rings properly, or over-torqued rings are something that we see a lot, or you may hear us talk about from time to time. I think it's come up on a number of our podcasts. Even we did a series where we had the one and only esteemed colleague, Mr. Ryan Muckenhern, going through the process of, there's an episode of mounting up a rifle scope properly. You can listen to that. We did it in a fashion where you could actually follow along while mounting your own rifle scope. And then the process of sighting in, and we've got all kinds of other stuff. But everything we've ever talked about in terms of rifle scopes, we've got all these long-range podcasts with a bunch of listens on them and downloads and stuff. We've got long-range or just even regular hunting podcasts, target shooting, any kind of competitive shooting, anything that involves a rifle scope on your gun is pretty much hinges upon this one thing.
You took the exact word out of my mouth, Jim. The performance of any of these rifle scope, ring-based systems, you took it, hinges on getting that scope mounted properly.
Yeah. Get the greatest, most expensive Gucci custom-built rifle on the planet, and equally as expensive and Gucci and amazing of a rifle scope on top of it, and you mount it up either with low-quality rings or even high-quality rings, but just done improperly, and the whole thing might as well be a giant paperweight. So, couple of notes on that we're going to talk about here. It is just Jimmy and Mark, actually, at this point in time. So
it's just us
on this podcast. But anyway, just referring to the idea of over-torqued scope rings, I think that's a term we use, and it could relate to sort of many things that are happening. And the important thing to consider when you're looking at a rifle scope is that tube on the outside, whether it's a 1-inch tube, 30 mil tube, 34, 35, that is merely a housing and a place for your rings to clamp around. There's a lot of internals on the inside of that. In fact, there's a whole nother tube in there we call the erector assembly. That has a gimbal at the end of it underneath approximately the magnification ring that then goes into a smattering of other different components within the rifle scope. There's also stuff in front of the erector assembly. If you have a scope with parallax adjustment, there's a parallax cell in there. There's objective cells, all kinds of things in there that are precision made, precision assembled to perform to a precision kind of environment or application, whether that be dialing in precise MOA or MRAD increments or holding zero, not wandering or anything like that. And so when we put these rings around this scope tube, it should be something that you absolutely pay a lot of attention to and try and do right the first time to avoid just a big headache and a big pain in the butt.
Well, like you said, Jim, there's a lot going on in there, and there's truly more than meets the eye. You look at a rifle scope, you go, here's where the glass is, here's where the glass is, there's the tube, and there's just a lot going on in there.
It's easy to forget that there's a lot else in there, and I kind of think of it. I think I haven't brought up a car reference on the podcast in a while, but a lot of people out there that are maybe they don't actually work for a car company, they know a lot about vehicles because you can generally open up the hood, you see a lot of stuff in there, you can take it apart, and if you have some know-how, you can put it all back together. That's not something a lot of people do with rifle scopes. There's not many people engine swapping or optical system swapping rifle scopes like, oh, dude, I took the erector unit out of this Razor Gen 2 and swapped it into my Crossfire 2, and now I got like 700 optical horsepowers.
No. You just have a bunch of parts now, actually.
Right, exactly. So we're here to explain how those things all kind of work together. But on the table, we have the classic Ruger American Predator 6.5 Creedmoor. I think we mentioned it countless times. It's got a Diamondback Tactical first focal plane on top, and it's set in a set of our actually older Pro rings that were kind of the vertically split style rings. We'll actually get into that. But anyway, the idea here is that anytime that you are torquing your rings down, that is the screws that clamp the ring around the scope's tube. There's a very specific kind of way that you'll want to do that and spec that you want to set your torque wrench to. We should talk about the torque wrench probably first. If you are, I guess even consider yourself a budding enthusiast of firearms, or you have intentions of or currently have more than one optic, probably worth getting yourself an inch-pounds torque wrench. We have them on our website. This is the Vortex one. There's other ones that you can get out there. You don't even necessarily have to get ours. We don't really care what one you get. Just get one because it's going to save yourself a lot of trouble in the future. But
I mean, it could save you trips to the range, thinking you have an inaccurate rifle, thinking you have a broken rifle scope, burning a bunch of ammo unnecessarily. I mean, the list goes on and on, Jim.
Exactly. So when you get yourself one of these, you hold all the power to setting your scope up right. Now, there's all the leveling and things like that, but when it actually comes time to torquing those fasteners down to the proper torque, what you're going to want to make sure is, one, that you don't have any Loctite or any kind of a thread locking compound on the screw threads. We'll get into why here shortly. But then you're also going to make sure that you're using the proper torque spec. Now, we spec out, and this is one of the confusing things out there, I think, for a lot of people. We spec out for our particular scopes with most rings, 15 to 18 inch pounds. It's what you see on the tag around the scope tube when you get the brand new scope out of the box, and it's what we'll tell you if you give us a call or shoot us a message on social media, whatever. 15 to 18 inch pounds, generally speaking, will do the job for most setups. A lot of these horizontally split rings that you see, that's kind of the most common style of ring. In fact, we don't have a vertically split ring like these older pro rings, which you see on this Ruger here. The pro rings have now become a horizontally split ring. Those are a little bit easier ring to deal with in terms of mounting and just sort of minimizing potential for an issue. But vertically split rings will do just fine as well. But if you're using that 15 to 18 inch pounds on most horizontally split rings, and you just kind of abide by the old, I would say it's like the lug nut way. You know, when you tighten lug nuts on a car, you don't tighten them in a circle. You sort of do opposing,
like a crisscross pattern.
Crisscross, yeah, star pattern, some people will say.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, that'll work just fine for you. Try and make sure that the ring gaps are somewhat even. I think some people get way more anal about that than they really need to.
Well, I think it's also important to point out they don't need to be touching either. They're not necessarily meant to be touching.
Exactly. So when you clamp down the ring halves together with those fasteners, it's most likely, and it almost just shouldn't be the case, that they are not touching on either side. So when we say ring gaps, some people get worried about that. They see gaps, they think, well, is this not the right size ring? Did I get the wrong size that's maybe too small and I need to go up a size? That's actually not the case. There should be a gap there. That gap is put in there as kind of a tolerance to have, because scope tubes themselves may have slight manufacturing tolerances in their actual diameter. Same with the rings, and part of the thing actually with that ring gap, and this goes into the thread locking compound thing, because a lot of people say, well, hey, a gun vibrates a lot. In case you haven't noticed, right? Like when you pull the trigger, booms happen, and you know, the gun recoils, a lot of things shake around. You know, I know my vision shakes around a little bit, and so why wouldn't I put a thread locking compound on those screws? It's essential, otherwise those screws are going to back out. Well, what a thread locking compound actually does is when you screw the fastener into the body of the rings or just whatever it is, it's going to take up any lash in the threads. That lash in the threads is sort of, again, it's kind of these tolerances that you get. It's the space in between that leaves under vibration the fastener with the ability to rattle around inside of the threads and then potentially backing its way out. But actually, when these rings get clamped down and there is that gap, it actually puts the fasteners under tension. And when they're under tension, they take up the lash and they actually sort of thread lock themselves, if you will. And so that's one reason why you don't need to use the thread locking compound. We haven't used them on any of our rifles around the shop, everything from 22s to 50 BMGs and all kinds of things in between, bolt action, semi-automatic, air rifles, whatever.
All sorts of recoil impulses there.
Exactly. And have had no issues, haven't had any screws backing out on us. And the other thing that can happen too is the downside to using thread lockers. Some people might say, well, why not? It's just like a double check, right? It's the old
insurance policy.
Well, the problem there is that when you are using one of these torque wrenches, when we actually think about what torque is, the torque that you put into the fasteners isn't how hard you spin it, even though that winds up determining when the torque wrench cams over. The torque that actually gets imparted through the rings and around the scope's tube is how far down these fasteners thread, and thus how much pressure from the actual ring halves are squeezing around the scope's tube. And so if you have this lubricant on there, which is a thread locking compound in liquid form most of the time, you got your blue Loctites, you got your Vibratites, whatever, that will cause it to be lubricated, and it will cause less force to be needed on the torque wrench to set the screws in further. And then by the time this thing finally cams over, you've screwed the screws in far deeper,
further than you should have.
Than they would have been screwed in had you not had that lubricant on there. So anyway, that would cause a situation where your rings are over torqued. And then getting into what's happening when they're over torqued, again, they're just squeezing in around this scope tube. Most modern scopes, in fact, I'm not aware of really any modern scopes unless they're kind of the sort of unique vintage style scopes that you see out there on occasion, are going to be aluminum tubes. And so, maybe back in the day, there was the steel tubes might have been a thing. And so steel rings and stuff like that, and just clamping it down however hard you could get it. That steel wasn't going to flex much, but with the aluminum, we're actually able to get much more precise optics and still obtain the durability necessary. I mean, most of the guys out there using optics in some pretty dangerous places are using optics that are made out of aluminum, and they're doing just fine. But it does have the potential to flex when you're clamping a big meaty metal ring around it. So that is where then you can begin to impinge some of these things on the inside of your rifle scope, causing poor tracking, lack of holding zero. You can even begin to create some image issues if you flex things enough. It's frustrating. If you've ever found yourself on the range trying to sight in a rifle scope, and when you adjust the turrets, what you're seeing downrange as far as what the adjustment did just doesn't match up with what you dialed into the turret, there could be an impingement going on in there. And it doesn't always mean that you didn't use the proper specs on your torque wrench, which I think we should also get into a little bit. Right, Mark?
Right.
Because you'll see here, this is MC Ryan's rifle, actually, and he's got it set up just right. See how these rings, in this case, are right in the middle of the scope tube's body. So he did the adjustment of where he put his rings on the actual base itself so that none of the rings were butted up against this magnification ring housing where it starts to split out from the scope's tube, the 30mm tube. None of them are butted up against the turret saddle where the turrets are sort of positioned on the rifle scope, and none of them are butted up against where the objective bell begins to kind of go out to its objective size. Those things, even a ring, I would say, torqued close to spec or just even a little bit over spec, in some of those areas, that's where a lot of these critical components like a parallax cell that needs to move freely or a gimbal that needs to allow the erector unit to move freely when you dial the turrets, those are located right under those places. Mm-hmm. And so they can be especially susceptible. So if you have the opportunity to move your rings away from those spots more towards the middle of the tube, definitely an ideal situation.
And some scopes are going to be easier to do that, and some scopes might be a little bit more difficult. It just depends on how much mounting length you have and a little bit of leeway there. But like you said, if you can stay away from those little more critical areas, you're going to be better off.
If you can. I know on my BLR, I had to put the ring, there was no way. It happens sometimes. There's just no way that you're ever going to make it happen. On my BLR, I do have one of the rings. I can't remember. I think it's close up to the turret saddle on the front ring. But then you just make sure, we went through the process of the rings that I had to get for that particular rifle. We didn't actually sell any rings unless I would have gotten a pick rail, and I would have been really stacking the rifle scope up higher than I wanted to. I got direct mount 2-piece rings. So this is another thing, is it goes into the quality of your rings or the concentricity of your rings in relation to one another. Because as you can imagine, the scope is straight. And if your rings and the hole that they make as you look through rings with no scope in it, of course, they make a hole where your rifle scope's tube should perfectly be. If they're not perfectly concentric to one another or lined up to one another, they'll just naturally, even with torque to the proper spec, put force on the scope in ways that can disrupt its proper function. So with that setup, the rings that we got, they're a high quality or highly regarded brand of rings that we put on there, but just all the tolerances that go into their direct mount, their 2-piece. So things are trying to line up that aren't connected by a 1-piece rail, for example, or something. It wasn't perfect. So we went through the process of a proper lapping job. And that, you have to get lapidary compound. You have to get the kind of lapping kit with the lapping bar. You have to have the proper scope tube size. So luckily we have a 1-inch one. Here at the shop, we've got pretty much stuff to lap basically any ring. But you know, that can be something that's a little daunting to take on. You know, you may want to take it to somebody who's a pro, or just make sure, you know, call us up too. We can walk you through the whole process as well. But that's something that we did to make sure that the rings were concentric to one another, so that way when we did torque to spec, even though it was up against, you know, that turret saddle, I was very conscious of the torque that it was being placed on, and I was very conscious of just trying to make sure, maybe instead of going to the 18 inch-pounds and pushing the bounds of our specs, you know, I would go to like the 16 inch-pounds range, and that holds just fine. So things like that are worth considering. And then also these vertically split rings.
Yep.
Those are a tricky one, right, Mark? Because we've had those, and now we've moved away from them more towards the horizontally split rings in our lineup. But
yeah, I mean, I can say I definitely prefer a horizontally split ring for a variety of reasons. But like I said, not that this isn't a perfectly viable option, because they certainly are, and they can work great. But I feel like the horizontally split ones are a little just more simple.
They're more forgiving, I would say.
They're more forgiving. That's the way to put it.
A little bit easier to get your scope leveled and whatnot, because it's not potentially going to just pop out the side while it's sitting there and you're trying to get the level just right. But then also we've seen with the horizontally split ones, or even some that are connected with two fasteners and like a cam at the top or whatever. Just there's all kinds of different very unique styles of rings out there. But some of the more unique ones that we see end up having this kind of vertical split to them. And at least I know I can say in the case of our older pro rings that are vertically split, and some of the other brands we've seen out there that are the more traditional vertically split ring, what you want to do is, we mentioned that sort of star pattern earlier, or the alternating lug nut style pattern that some might do on their car wheels or something. You actually don't want to do that when you're torquing.
That's true.
The fasteners of these vertically split rings. So you see on here, and I'll flip this Ruger American around here. It is safe. Everybody's good. We'll point it in safe directions, yada, yada. But you can see there's 4 fasteners here on the side that would end up getting torqued to spec. Now, instead of going, you know, top left, bottom right, bottom left, top right, and kind of doing that sequence until they're torqued to spec and getting 2 equal gaps on both of the gaps here in the rings, we would actually torque one side fully to even sometimes we'll recommend, with these style of rings, we even recommend going over our normal spec to about 20 inch-pounds or so.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we would torque this top side first. So these top 2 fasteners would get torqued to about 20 inch-pounds first, before even necessarily touching the bottom 2 fasteners. And then those bottom 2 fasteners, once the tops are done and that gap is fully closed,
right,
then we go to the bottoms and we torque them to around, you know, 16 to 18 inch-pounds. And there we will have a little bit of a gap in the rings, and that should be there.
Yeah, and I guess it's also interesting to point out, like, the way you're describing this process, which I'm definitely more familiar with horizontally split rings. A lot of the stuff that we talked about before actually doesn't apply to a vertically split ring.
Right. And I know the first time I ever tried mounting a scope in these exact rings, I did it where I had an even gap on both sides. I did the whole kind of star lug nut pattern, whatever, and I ended up having my scope slip, and I couldn't get it quite zeroed in. And I remember thinking, like, I mounted this up perfect to spec. But then that's where I learned that these vertically split ones can just have a slightly different process. Mm-hmm. It's always worth it, again, just since there's so many kinds of rings out there. You can always give us a call on these things to ask about, because we've tried pretty much everything under the sun. It doesn't even have to be our brand.
I was going to say, it doesn't have to be our rings.
Yeah. There's one out there, and I can't remember the name of the brand, but it's called like, it's called like American something scope. Oh, it's a very, very unique ring setup. And in fact, I think it's even almost like a one-piece mount, if I'm not mistaken. And they spec out on their rings. When you open up the rings, they spec out like 60 inch-pounds or something. I remember the first time we saw that, we were like, oh no, this is going to create a bunch of problems.
Right.
Well, they created some very unique system. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. And we tried torquing to their specs, and we didn't have any issues.
Okay, gotcha.
That's like the first time we've ever seen anything like this. And many, many times with other rings, you can go, you know, just a few inch-pounds over our recommended spec, and you begin to have issues. So it all depends. Everything is a case-by-case basis. Certainly there's people out there who have been over-torquing their scopes for years, and somehow they've gotten away with it, and they've just gotten lucky that they haven't had the problem. But
well, I think sometimes in that case, too, it could be more of a set it and forget it type scenario where
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, maybe you went through the process, you burned some extra ammo, maybe the erector tube wasn't pinged, but you finally got her to snap over and bam, you got your zero, you put the caps on and off you go, and the rifle's zeroed, sighted in, and you're never touching those turrets again unless you lose your zero, right?
The erector is in there just strangled, but you've locked it into the right place, or at least close enough to the right place that it's not going anywhere. And yeah, like you said, you set it and forget it.
So, and that's going to be different. You start dialing that same scope that is sighted in and zeroed and working fine probably, but
Yeah.
you start to, turn your turrets.
Yeah. Or you go, oh, I'm going to adjust the parallax knob, and then all of a sudden it's bound up, or it starts making a scratching sound. That's because the parallax
That's not
cell's
good.
bound up.
By the way, I said turnits intentionally there anyway.
I know. I know, but I'm glad you mentioned it because other people might.
I didn't want to read the
I've heard you say.
YouTube comments and then
I've heard you say turnits for many years, Mark. We're a little over 10 minutes, but that's okay. This is important.
It's critically important. It's such a big deal. It doesn't seem like a big deal. Your scope's probably going to come, or your rings, it's going to come with a wrench to do the job. It will definitely do the job.
Oh, yeah, the little L handle key that you get with it. Yeah, I mean, we generally say if you don't have a torque wrench, don't use the long handle of the L handle little thing that comes in the pack.
Right.
Use the short end and torque until you just feel your thumb is uncomfortable enough that you don't want to torque it anymore. And generally speaking, that'll get you about close. If you don't have a torque wrench on it, that's like an emergency situation. We do recommend using a torque wrench. And many times, I'll say this. Now, this isn't to throw shade at any of the gunsmiths out there that listen to this podcast or any of the people that work behind store counters or whatever. Because a lot of you who probably listen to this podcast know what you're doing. But there are some out there who are either used to the old way or they haven't been trained up properly since starting wherever they're at. And, they just they can tend to make mistakes. I generally, if some people are like, hey, I've never done this before, I don't trust myself to mount it up, I would say, you know what? The fact that you're talking to us right now or you're listening to this right now and you're trying to do it the right way, I trust you more than I would a random stranger I've never known before who, says they're a gunsmith, out of their garage or something like that. Not that there aren't any good garage gunsmiths out there, but I would trust you more because it's quite simple. There's a few steps. It's just that if you miss those steps or you get a spec wrong, something like that, you can have problems.
It's easy to do it right, and it's easy to do it wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm going to throw an advertisement for the new Pro Rings, though, Jim.
They're amazing.
I love them. They don't cost, we have lots of different rings, and I love them all.
Yes.
But they don't cost an arm and a leg. They're super precise. They're darn near fail-safe. They've got the torque specs right on the ring.
That's true.
I love them.
Yeah.
I love them.
They're awesome.
They work great.
So, okay. Hopefully, we have we can get off our soapbox now about the I think the rings thing.
Okay.
I think we did all right.
Okay.
I don't think we were necessarily like yelling at people, but I just
no, I'm excited about it.
I am too. But we'll send you back into your daily life, and now you have a little bit of at least trivia knowledge that you can use at parties. Tell your friends about how scopes work and their rings and stuff. If you have any questions about this stuff too, let us know. You can hit us up via the phone. We got a new phone number here at Vortex.
Yes.
800-4-VORTEX.
Number 4.
Or the old one actually still works too if you have that memorized. But you can give us a call, hit us up on social media, all those things. Shoot us a fax, as Mark would say. And we'd love to talk with you all about the different kinds of rings out there. So with that said, thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.